key turned in the lock with a familiar, heavy click. But as the door swung open, the scent that met me wasn't the comforting aroma of the sandalwood candles I lit every morning. Instead, the air was thick with the cloying, synthetic sweetness of cheap lilac perfume and the greasy smell of fried onions. I stood frozen in the entryway of my own home, staring at a mountain of black, heavy-duty trash bags piled high against the mahogany sideboard my father had restored for me. Through the open door of my home office, the room I had spent 3 years turning into a sanctuary of glass, velvet, and silence, I heard the rhythmic shir-shir of a curtain rod being dragged across a bracket. Martha, my mother-in-law, stepped into the hallway, a tape measure draped around her neck like a conqueror's stole, her face tightening into a mask of feigned sympathy the moment she saw me. "Oh, Elena, you're home early," she said, her voice dripping with that artificial sweetness that always preceded a blow. "Don't look so shocked, dear. We had to move quickly while the movers were available. Your sister-in-law's situation became quite dire this morning, and since this room was mostly just sitting here filled with your hobbies, it only made sense to get her settled in immediately. Family doesn't wait for invitations when there's a crisis, does it?" She didn't wait for an answer, turning back to the room to bark an order at someone I couldn't yet see, leaving me standing amongst the ruins of my privacy, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Everything had been so different only 6 months ago. Back then, my life felt like a masterpiece I had finally finished painting. I remember the morning I officially moved into this apartment. The light had been a pale, buttery yellow, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and reflecting off the polished oak floors. It was a pre-war gem in the heart of the city, a space I had purchased with the inheritance my grandmother left specifically for me, with a strict legal caveat that it remained my separate property. It was my fortress. I spent months choosing the exact shade of sea salt gray for the walls and searching for the perfect mid-century modern furniture that felt both elegant and lived in. Mark, my husband of 4 years, had seemed just as enamored with the place as I was. In those early days, our life was a sequence of quiet, beautiful rituals. We'd wake up to the muffled sound of the city waking up below us, and I'd grind fresh Blue Mountain coffee beans while Mark read the news at the teak breakfast bar. The kitchen always smelled like toasted sourdough and expensive espresso. Mark would wrap his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder, and whisper about how lucky we were to have found such a peaceful corner of the world. He was a gentleman, or so I thought, soft-spoken, perhaps a bit too eager to please, but I mistook his lack of backbone for a peaceful temperament. I loved the way he looked in the soft morning light, and I never minded that I was the primary breadwinner, or that the roof over our heads was entirely my provision. I felt like I was protecting us, building a nest where the world couldn't reach us. The first cracks in the porcelain didn't appear as a shattering blow. They were more like hairline fractures, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. It started with the keys. Martha had lost her set of guest keys twice in 1 month, necessitating me giving her a new pair each time, until I realized she was actually distributing them to her other children, just in case of an emergency. Then came the unannounced visits. I'd be in the middle of a high-stakes Zoom call for my architectural firm, and I'd hear the front door creak open, followed by Martha's heavy footsteps and the clattering of Tupperware. "I thought you looked a bit peaked on Sunday, Elena," she'd say, barging into my kitchen and rearranging my spice rack according to her own incomprehensible logic. "You don't feed Mark enough hearty food. This modern, leafy nonsense isn't what a man needs." I'd catch Mark's eye across the room, expecting him to say something, to remind her that this was our home, our sanctuary. But Mark would just offer a sheepish, apologetic shrug and go back to his laptop. "She means well, Elle," he'd mutter later that night, his voice thick with a cowardice I was beginning to recognize. "She's just lonely since Dad passed. Let's not make a scene over a bit of soup." But the soup was just the beginning. The real shadow over our household was Mark's sister, Cynthia. Cynthia was 32 going on 16, a woman who treated life like a buffet, where everyone else was expected to pay her tab. She had found herself in 3 different career paths in as many years, each one ending in a dramatic exit and a plea for a temporary loan from Martha, which really meant a loan from Mark's savings. I remember a particular dinner 3 months ago, the air thick and humid as a summer storm brewed outside. Martha had been unusually quiet, her eyes darting around my spacious guest room turned office. She had touched the velvet upholstery of my reading chair with a lingering, possessive stroke. "It's such a shame," Martha had remarked, her voice casual, almost airy. "That whole room is dedicated to just books and drawings. When people out there are struggling for a roof over their heads, Cynthia's landlord is being a real tyrant about the rent, you know. She's so stressed. She's lost her appetite." I had felt a cold prickle of apprehension crawl up my spine. I took a slow sip of my wine, the vintage crisp and acidic on my tongue. "That's unfortunate for Cynthia," I said, my voice steady, though I could feel Mark stiffening beside me. "But this room is my workspace. I have clients coming in and out next month for the new gallery project. It's not just a hobby room, Martha." Martha hadn't replied then. She had simply smiled, a thin, sharp expression that didn't reach her pale eyes. Mark had reached under the table and squeezed my hand, but it wasn't a squeeze of support. It was a plea for silence, a silent command to let his mother have the last word. At the time, I thought I had set a boundary. I thought the walls of my home were thick enough to keep out the entitlement of my in-laws. I didn't realize that while I was busy building my career and maintaining our beautiful life, Martha was already measuring the windows for Cynthia's curtains, and Mark was looking the other way, letting her hold the tape measure. The piece I cherished was nothing more than a fragile glass ornament, and Martha was already swinging the hammer. The weeks leading up to that afternoon were a masterclass in subtle manipulation, though I was too blinded by my own sense of security to see the trap being laid. Martha's presence in my home had shifted from occasional annoyance to a persistent, suffocating fog. She began asking pointed questions about the square footage of the apartment, her eyes roving over the moldings like an appraiser. I remember one Tuesday evening, the light fading into a bruised purple over the city skyline, when she sat at my dining table, tracing the grain of the wood with a gnarled finger. It's so much space for just 2 people, Elena," she'd mused, her voice low and hypnotic. "In my day, we shared rooms. We didn't believe in these creative sanctuaries. It seems a bit selfish, don't you think? Especially when Cynthia is practically living in a closet with a radiator that screams all night." I had laughed it off, a nervous, fluttering sound in my throat. "It's not just a sanctuary, Martha. It's my office. I pay the mortgage on this selfish space so Mark and I can live comfortably." I expected Mark to chime in, to remind her that my hard work funded the very wine she was currently sipping. But Mark had stayed hunched over his phone, his thumb rhythmically scrolling through a feed I couldn't see. He didn't look up. He didn't even blink. He just muttered something about family helping family under his breath, a phrase that had become his new mantra. Then came the accidents. My expensive drafting pens began to go missing. I found a coffee ring on a set of blueprints for a multi-million-dollar project. Blueprints I had explicitly told Mark were off limits. When I confronted him, his face went a strange, blotchy red. "Mom was just trying to tidy up, Elle. She's trying to be useful. Why do you always have to be so territorial? It's just paper." His voice had a sharp, brittle edge I'd never heard before. He started taking calls in the bathroom, the low murmur of his voice buzzing against the tiles like a trapped insect. Every time I entered a room, he'd snap his laptop shut or flip his phone over. The air in our home, once so clear and welcoming, began to feel heavy, charged with the static electricity of a coming storm. The point of no return, the moment my world didn't just crack, but shattered, happened an hour before I found Martha in my hallway. I had returned home early because I'd forgotten a hard drive for a presentation. The apartment was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. As I walked toward my office, I noticed Mark's leather satchel sitting on the floor, spilled open. A thick manila folder had slid out, its contents fanned across the hardwood. I knelt to pick them up, my mind already on my meeting, until my eyes snagged on a word. Sublease. My breath hitched. I pulled the papers out fully. It wasn't just a sublease. It was a formal occupancy agreement drafted by a cut-rate paralegal. It listed my address, my sanctuary, and named Cynthia as the primary occupant of the guest suite. But it was the signature line that made the world tilt on its axis. There, in the familiar loopy scrawl I had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and grocery lists, was Mark's signature. And next to it, under owner/authorized representative, was a signature that made my stomach turn into a cold knot of lead, a forged version of my own name. The room began to spin. A sharp, high-pitched ringing erupted in my ears, drowning out the distant sound of traffic. I felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea that forced me to lean against the wall, cold plaster biting into my shoulder. My hands were shaking so violently the papers rattled like dry leaves. He hadn't just suggested his sister move in. He had conspired with his mother to legally steal a piece of my home, forged my handwriting, and essentially sold me out in my own living room. The hobbies Martha mentioned weren't just a slight. They were a calculated justification for their theft. "Elena, is that you?" Martha's voice drifted from the kitchen, followed by the heavy, confident tread of her orthopedic shoes. I scrambled to my feet, shoving the folder back into Mark's bag, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. I couldn't face her yet. I couldn't let her see the sheer, unadulterated terror and rage vibrating through my limbs. I ducked into the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, watching my pale, ghostly reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked like those of a stranger, blown wide, dark with a realization that could never be unlearned. When I finally emerged, the takeover was in full swing. The trash bags, the smell of onions, the violation of my office. It was all a physical manifestation of the document I had just seen. Cynthia was there now, too, draped over my velvet sofa as if she'd lived there for years, her boots leaving mud streaks on the cream fabric. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Hey, Elle," she said, her voice a lazy drawl. "Mom said you wouldn't mind if I used your office desk for my makeup station. The lighting in there is killer." I stood in the center of my ruined living room, looking from the mud on my sofa to the smug, triumphant glitter in Martha's eyes. I felt the heat of the forged signature burning in my mind, a brand of betrayal that scorched away every ounce of the peaceful woman I used to be. My pulse was a drumbeat of war in my temples. I looked at Martha, who was now hanging a tacky, crocheted "Home Sweet Home" sign over my minimalist clock. "You really didn't think this through, did you, Martha?" I said, my voice surprisingly low, surprisingly cold. It was the first time I felt that click, the sound of my heart turning to ice. "I don't know what you mean, dear," Martha chirped, not even turning around. "We're family. We don't need to think through helping each other. Now, where do you keep the extra linens? Cynthia finds the guest sheets a bit scratchy." I didn't answer. I walked past her, my movements mechanical and precise. I didn't go to the linen closet. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and watched them through the reflection in the window. I wasn't the victim they thought I was. They had spent weeks planning this invasion, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. I was an architect. I knew exactly how to build things, and I knew exactly which load-bearing walls to pull down to make the whole structure collapse on their heads. The occupancy agreement was still in Mark's bag, a ticking time bomb, and I was just about to start the clock. I didn't wait for the front door to open. I heard the fumbled rattling of keys and knew Mark was home. My heart felt like a cold stone in my chest. I sat at the kitchen island, the manila folder placed squarely on the granite counter, the forged occupancy agreement face up like a death warrant. Mark stepped inside, his face flushing a guilty, mottled pink the moment his eyes met mine. He looked at the bags in the hallway, at his sister lounging on the sofa, and then finally at me. He didn't say hello. He didn't kiss my cheek. He just stopped dead in his tracks, his shoulders hunching as if he were bracing for an impact. "Mark, look! Elena's home," Martha chirped from the guest room, her voice echoing with a forced, manic cheer. "We've almost got Cynthia's things organized. Tell Elena how much better this is for everyone. Tell her how selfish it was to keep this room empty." Mark didn't look at his mother. He looked at the folder on the counter. His Adam's apple bobbed convulsively. "Elle, I can explain," he whispered, his voice so thin it barely carried across the room. "Explain which part, Mark?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "The part where you invited your sister to move into my property without a word to me? Or the part where you forged my signature on a legal document to make it happen?" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Cynthia finally looked up from her phone, her eyes narrowing. "It's not your property, Elena. You're married. Everything is half Mark's. That's how it works. Stop being such a drama queen about a spare room." I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat. "Actually, Cynthia, that's not how the law works when there's a premarital inheritance and a strictly separate deed. But let's talk about Mark's contribution, shall we?" I turned my gaze back to my husband. "Did you tell them, Mark? Did you tell them you have no legal right to this apartment?" Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man drowning in shallow water. He glanced at his mother, a silent, pathetic plea for rescue. Martha stepped into the kitchen, her face hardening, the mask of the sweet grandmother finally slipping. "Now listen here. Family is more important than deeds and papers. Cynthia has been evicted, Elena. She has nowhere to go. You have all this, extra. It's only right that you share." Mark agreed. "He's the head of this household, and he gave us his word." "He gave you a forgery," I snapped, standing up. The movement was so sudden, Martha actually flinched. "He stole my identity to satisfy your entitlement. And you!" I pointed a finger at Mark. "You stood by and watched them dismantle my life while I was at work? You let her throw my professional equipment into trash bags?" I thought you'd understand eventually," Mark stammered, his eyes darting to the floor. "I thought once she was here and you saw how much she needed help, you'd soften up. Mom said you were too focused on money and your image, and that you needed to learn the value of sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "You mean theft." "Don't you talk to him like that!" Martha shrieked, stepping between us. "He's doing what's best for this family. And frankly, Elena, you should be grateful. We're here to help you. We've seen how you've been lately, obsessive, cold, neglecting your duties as a wife. I've even told the building manager that you've been having some mental struggles. That's why we're here, to keep things running while you get yourself together." The room tilted. That was twist number one. She hadn't just moved Cynthia in, she was already poisoning the well, setting a narrative of my instability to justify their presence. My skin crawled with a sudden icy realization of how deep this rot went. "You told the manager I'm unstable?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "It was for your own good, honey," Martha said, her tone shifting back to a patronizing coo. "We need to make sure you don't do anything rash, like trying to kick your own family out onto the street." "Wait," Cynthia interrupted, standing up from the sofa and smoothing her skirt. "Tell her the rest, Mark. Tell her why I really can't leave." Mark looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. "Cynthia, not now." "No, tell her." Cynthia smirked, crossing her arms. "I'm pregnant, Elena. I'm having a baby in 6 months. And since Mark already spent my startup money on his gambling debts last year, he owes me a place to live. He promised me the big master suite once you settled into the guest room." Twist number 2 hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I looked at Mark, the man I had slept beside for 4 years. Gambling debts? Our vacation fund, the $30,000 I thought was sitting in our joint high-yield account for our trip to Japan. Was it gone? "Mark," I breathed, the air leaving my lungs. "The savings account, is it empty?" Mark's silence was my answer. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer an excuse. He just stood there, a hollow shell of a man, staring at his expensive Italian leather shoes. Shoes I had bought him. "It wasn't much, Elena," he finally mumbled. "I was going to win it back. I just needed a little more time. Mom helped me cover the interest payments so you wouldn't find out." "So you're all in on it," I said, looking at the three of them. A mother who enabled her son's addiction and her daughter's laziness, a sister who used her pregnancy as a weapon of war, and a husband who was a thief and a coward. "You've spent my money, forged my name, and now you're trying to take my home." "It's our home now," Martha said, her voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. "And if you try to kick us out, I'll make sure everyone knows you're an unfit, unstable woman who tried to throw a pregnant girl onto the street. Think about your reputation, Elena. Think about your firm. One call to your partners about your breakdown, and you're finished." I looked at Mark one last time. "Are you going to say anything? Are you going to tell them to leave? Are you going to tell the truth?" Mark looked up, his eyes glassy and weak. "Maybe. Maybe we can just try it for a month, Elle. Just to see? Let's talk about this later, okay? Everyone's just emotional right now. Let's just have some dinner and—" "Later?" I cut him off, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. "There is no later, Mark." I picked up my phone. My hands were no longer shaking. The click I had felt earlier was now a solid, unshakable foundation. They thought they had trapped me with threats of reputation and family duty, but they had vastly underestimated who they were dealing with. I had spent my career designing structures that could withstand earthquakes. I certainly knew how to survive a few parasites. "What are you doing?" Martha demanded, her eyes narrowing as I began typing rapidly. "I'm calling the locksmith," I said, my voice ringing out with a new, terrifying clarity. "And then, I'm calling my attorney. And after that, I'm calling the police to report a forged legal document and a residential trespass." "You wouldn't dare!" Martha hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. "I'll ruin you, Elena. I'll tell everyone." "Go ahead, Martha," I said, walking toward the door. "Tell the world. But do it from the sidewalk, because you have exactly 10 minutes to get your daughter and those trash bags out of my hallway before the police arrive. And Mark, don't bother coming back. I've already changed the password to the gate, and by tomorrow, I'll have changed the locks on your life." As I stepped out into the cool evening air of the hallway, the screaming started behind the closed door. But for the first time in months, the air felt clean. The battle had only just begun, but I already knew who was going to be left standing. The screaming inside the apartment muffled as I stepped into the carpeted silence of the hallway. But the sound didn't bother me anymore. The vibration of the rage had been replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. I sat in my car in the basement garage, the engine off, the only light coming from the pale blue glow of my phone. I didn't cry. Tears felt like a luxury for a woman who still had something to lose. I had already lost my husband, my trust, and my sense of safety. All that was left was the property and the truth. I called Marcus, my grandmother's estate attorney. His voice was a calm, low baritone that acted like an anchor. I told him everything: the occupancy agreement, the forged signature, the missing 30,000, and the threats. "Elena," he said, his voice sharpening with professional indignation, "they've handed you a gift. Forgery and grand larceny are not family disputes. Stay where you are. I'm calling the precinct and the building's legal counsel. Do not engage with them again until I'm there." The transformation wasn't a sudden burst of light. It was a slow hardening of my soul. I realized I had been playing the role of the supportive wife so well that I had become invisible in my own life. I had been a bank, a landlord, and a safety net, but never a partner, because you can't be a partner to a ghost. Mark was a ghost of a man, inhabited by his mother's voice and his own weaknesses. I pulled out my tablet and began the process they hadn't expected. I revoked Mark's access to our joint accounts, what little was left, and I sent a high-resolution scan of the forged document to the building's board. 2 hours later, I walked back into my apartment. I wasn't alone. Marcus was there, looking formidable in a charcoal suit, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and the building manager. Mr. Henderson, who looked deeply offended that such drama was occurring under his watch. The scene inside was pathetic. Martha was mid-sentence, lecturing a cowering Mark about how they would redecorate the master bedroom. Cynthia was eating yogurt straight from the tub, her feet still on my velvet sofa. When the police entered, the yogurt tub hit the floor with a wet thud. "What is the meaning of this?" Martha shrieked, rising like a bloated cobra. "Elena, I told you! You're having a breakdown! Officers, this woman is mentally unstable. She's—" "Mrs. Miller?" Mr. Henderson interrupted, his voice dripping with icy disdain. "I received the security footage of you entering this building with unauthorized movers using a key that was never registered to you. And I have seen the document your son attempted to file with our office this afternoon." One of the officers stepped forward, holding the manila folder. "Mark Miller, we need to discuss this signature. We've already had a preliminary look at the lease on file. This doesn't match the owner's handwriting." Mark looked at me, his face a pale, sweating mask of terror. "Elle, please. Tell them it's okay. Tell them we talked about it. I was just trying to help Cynthia. She's pregnant, Elle. You can't do this to a pregnant woman." I looked at Cynthia, who was trying to look small and vulnerable. "Is she, Mark? Or is that just another lie you all cooked up to guilt me into silence?" I turned to the officer. "I want them removed. Now. I am the sole owner of this property. My husband has no legal right to invite guests to reside here without my consent, and he certainly has no right to forge my name to facilitate it." "You can't kick him out!" Martha roared, her face turning a terrifying shade of purple. "He's your husband. He lives here." "Not anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through her, screaming like a blade. "Mark, you have 5 minutes to take your personal clothes and leave. Your mother and sister are trespassing. If they aren't out in 5 minutes, I'm pressing full charges for the forgery and the theft of the $30,000 you took from our joint account." Mark's mouth fell open. He looked at the police, then at the stern face of Marcus. He finally realized that the quiet, sweet Elena, who always smoothed things over, was dead. "Elle, please," he whimpered. "Where will I go?" I looked him straight in the eyes, and for a moment, the room was utterly silent. "Go where you've always been, Mark. Under your mother's shadow. I'm sure there's plenty of room there for all three of you." The next 30 minutes were a blur of chaotic motion. Martha was escorted out in tears, screaming about my cold heart, until the elevator doors finally muffled her voice. Cynthia followed, dragging her heavy-duty trash bags, her face a mask of bitter resentment. Mark was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway, a single suitcase in his hand, looking back at the beautiful, warm home he had helped me build, and then helped to destroy. He waited for me to say something, for a last-minute reprieve. I just stood by the window, my back to him, watching the city lights begin to twinkle. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. The legal aftermath was a surgical extraction. With the evidence of the forgery and the gambling debts, the divorce was fast and brutal. Mark got nothing from the apartment. In fact, he ended up owing me for the missing funds, a debt his mother had to eventually pay by selling her own car. Cynthia, as it turned out, wasn't pregnant. It was a desperate lie to secure a room in a rich neighborhood. 6 months later, the apartment is quiet again. The smell of cheap lilac and fried onions is a distant bad memory. Tonight, the air is filled with the scent of fresh eucalyptus and the crisp, clean smell of the rain hitting the balcony. I've replaced the velvet sofa. I've replaced the locks. But more importantly, I've replaced the woman who thought she needed to carry everyone else's weight to be loved. I sit at my teak breakfast bar, the same place where I once watched Mark and felt lucky. Now I look at the space and feel something much more powerful: peace. I pick up my pen and begin sketching the designs for a new project, a sanctuary for women who have lost their way. I realize now that a home isn't built of bricks and mahogany. It's built of boundaries and the courage to defend them. As I blow out my sandalwood candle, the smoke curling elegantly into the night air, I whisper the only truth that matters now. I am finally, truly home.